As we wrap up our special series on human trafficking against their will, David Batstone, the author of the book Not for Sale and founder and president of the Not for Sale campaign, is here to tell us more about the problem of human trafficking in the United States and what we as citizens can do about it. Hi, David.
Hi, it's great to be here. Well,
it's good to have you here and bring attention to this growing problem in the United States. I think a lot of people don't realize quite how prevalent it is. But what are we talking about in terms of numbers?
Well, inside the United States, we're probably talking around 200,000 people at least that are trafficked in bondage. Many more vulnerable, many more have escaped, but 200,000 today probably are in bondage.
And who are the victims here?
You know, they could be your next door neighbor. They could be anyone. They could be the person down the street. There are people from other countries that are brought to the United States, but what really shocked me was that this is not something that only happens over in Thailand or Romania, but it's here in our own cities, in our own neighborhoods, our own suburbs.
And it's something that our children are vulnerable to and our immigrant population as well. And this is something that you actually saw firsthand, and that's sort of how you got involved in this whole process. Tell me that story.
Yeah, you know, it found me. I wasn't looking for it. My favorite restaurant in San Francisco was a neighborhood Indian restaurant. I would go there all the time. And young kids would be washing the dishes, waitering the tables, and it never really struck me that they might not be members of the family that were running the place. And so when I opened up my local newspaper one day, it was my shock that my favorite restaurant down the block was the center of a trafficking ring that brought 500 young kids from India into the United States to work in retail establishments, to work farm field work, or perhaps even to go into the commercial sex industry.
And what's promised to their families back home? How do they get from there to here?
Well, in this particular case, and it's very common, they were deceived that they were going to America to get a job and an education. It was the American dream. You imagine you're in a very poor village in India, and someone says, you know what, we can get you to an American university. We can get you a job that you can send money back home. As soon as they get into the country, into the United States, their visa or their passport's taken from them. They're thrown into an apartment with 20 other young people who are in the same situation, and they're forced to work 7 days a week without compensation.
They really break these kids down, both physically and mentally, right?
They really do. And, you know, the common thread as I began then to investigate, well, what patterns do you find across the United States and around the globe? I found that within the first 24 hours, the trafficker will physically abuse, usually sexually abuse, a child or a woman who they have trafficked. And so it's to get into their mind right away that I own you, I dominate you, you try and leave, this will happen again.
And your tainted goods, I mean, the whole thing in there. You know, your family's not going to want you back now, you might as well make money doing this, that kind of mentality, correct?
Absolutely, and that's why the sexual violation. It's to say you have shamed yourself and your family. You can't go back. And in some cultures, that's the case. They don't want them back.
Right, so this dream, American dream, turns into a complete nightmare. And there are a couple of kinds of human trafficking. We hear a lot about the sex part because that's so incredibly lucrative.
That's right.
Right, but there are other forms as well, like you mentioned, the kids working in the restaurant. Right?
Absolutely, and we've done more research on this as we've investigated it. About half of the kids who are put into trafficking situations, either inside the United States or from brought overseas here, half of them end up in the commercial sex industry. I was surprised how many end up in domestic labor as a nanny or a housekeeper, about 27 to 28%. And then you're talking smaller but consistent numbers in restaurants, 7 to 10%, construction, farm field work, and hotels, changing the bed sheets in those hotels. That's also about 7 to 10%.
And you're going to see a lot of these people gathered in big cities, particularly places where there's conventions and things like that going on, correct?
That's a common place. It's very frequent in large cities where there's conferences. But what I was most shocked about, that it happens in small towns. After my Indian restaurant experience, I went to a small town outside of Worcester, Mass., where an evangelical pastor from a church had gone to India and trafficked this young girl into his community. For 5 years, he kept her there as his house slave and sex slave. And he had a wife and a child the same age, a teenage daughter the same age. For 5 years, that little town just never suspected. It was like me in the Indian restaurant. You just never... That's not in your grid to think that maybe this child is not theirs on their own will, but they are being trafficked.
And the tough thing is a lot of these kids are moved around from place to place to alleviate any kind of suspicion, correct? But what are some of the things that we can look for? Because let's sort of move into how we can galvanize into action here and try to stop this trend. What are some telltale signs?
Well, it's really important that just the normal citizen look for these things, because that's where most of our tips come from.
Right.
And there are things to look for, like the fact that someone is kept controlled of all the time, that you try to talk to them and someone might come over and say, hey, move on, don't talk to that individual. So that if you feel like, gee, this person's being isolated, this young child or this woman, she's being isolated, there's a sign. If someone says,
they got their head down, no eye contact, no,
exactly.
Because a lot of times we assume, well, maybe that person doesn't speak English or whatever.
That's right. That's right.
But it could be a sign of something really serious.
It could be a sign.
Yeah.
You have to add these things up.
Right.
Someone in some of our investigation that we have been doing in massage parlors, if they only speak Korean or Chinese or Spanish, another add that sign up. If they can't leave the place of their establishment, so that what we do when we go in undercover is we'll say to a massage parlor, can they come to our hotel and give a massage?
Right.
No, they do not leave here. We'll pay you quadruple. No, they don't leave here.
Oh, so that's a sign, because they're being completely controlled.
Absolutely.
Right?
They don't want them to be outside of their workplace, their house, their hostel.
Now, if we have suspicions, what do? Don't ever take it upon yourself to take action. But what sort of steps can citizens take?
Well, the one thing is that the Health and Human Services, it's a federal agency, has a hotline, and it's 888-3737, 888. So that's 888-3737, 888. So you can call that. You can go to groups like Not for Sale. We have a website, and you just tell us your suspicion, and we get it to the right authority, and we can check it out. So that there's things that you can do, but you're right. Going undercover yourself or trying to bust the ring.
Right.
I mean, these people are making so much money on traffic victims that they might harm you if you somehow undermine their source of income. So it's important to
you need actually bring all the resources of the government and like your organization to bear, right?
And what we are trying to do in the Not for Sale campaign is bring together the law enforcement agencies together with religious communities, together with universities, together to create these community task forces. Because really that's how we can solve it. Law enforcement will not solve this problem. They can be a part of the puzzle, a piece of the puzzle, but they're not going to solve it. It's going to have to come from a community engaged group.
We're talking about a safe haven here, and a lot of times that can be found in these abolitionist churches, this movement. There's about, 2,000
of
those in the U.S. Where else?
Really, it's in the U.S. that's really important that we've had these because of the fact that there's not enough shelters. Now, Health and Human Services wants to, seed that so that we can start to have more shelters. But say the city of San Francisco, one of the major international ports of trafficking victims into our country, and we're talking of the fact there's 10 beds for a shelter. That's the only shelter we have for trafficking victims.
Wow, it's
so that's why we started this sanctuary movement of churches, so that we will be an abolitionist church. A safe haven will be given to a victim of child trafficking.
It's non-denominational?
It's non-denominational. In fact, we're getting synagogues too. So it's Catholic, Protestant, we're looking for a temple, any kind of place that would say, and as members of that church maybe will open their home, which is an important part of that. We've also gone to universities because universities have centers that gather research. So we say, in your own community, map out where trafficking is happening. Into the field work, into the hotels and restaurants, into the sex industry. Map that out and then bring that to law enforcement. Law enforcement brings to the shelters and to the churches. So it's creating this network.
Right. And it seems that it would be so important to have community action and awareness here, because the people who are enslaved and entrenched in this world, they're not going to have access to the kinds of things we're talking about. They're not going to have access to your website. They're not going to know what the sign on the church means. I mean, they are in prison. Right?
Absolutely. And that's why we really focus on community groups getting the word out to their community. This is here. It's a problem, and we're a resource for that. Because you're right. They wouldn't know. The average citizen, if someone was a slave next door, what would we do? What do I do about it? It's very important then that community groups are being able to, broadcast the fact. Like this church that we had on our segment at CBS today. We have this church that says, we in this community will be a sanctuary. Bring us the contact. We'll get legal and medical aid to them. We'll get them to the right place. But, to know where to turn.
Real quickly, as parents, if we're fearful that our kids could be victimized as they're recruited in high schools and by, seemingly, an innocuous friend. We had a story about a girl who went on a sleepover and boom.
Yes.
I mean, it's just horrifically frightening. What can we do?
I have 4 kids, 16, 14, 12, and 10. And I tell you, I might sound paranoid to some parents out there, but really, you have to take some precautions. One, if your child's going to go out to a movie or go out to a club, always have them accompanied. Who are you going with? Are you going to be with a friend? If your child's going to have a sleepover or go to a party, just go to the door and say, is there going to be any supervision? Are you going to be here tonight?
Right.
I have taken my child to a party, and the parent has said, no, I'm going out. The kids are fine. I said, okay, my child's not going to be here.
Right. Big red flag.
It is a big red flag. Also, it's the things we always learn, don't talk to strangers, but teach your kids how to be polite but draw a line around,
in the mall.
In the mall.
Yeah, right.
Traffickers look for where kids are going to be vulnerable. Now, certainly runaways, if a kid runs away from home within the first 48 hours, they will be contacted by a trafficker. That's studied research. But even at the mall where they're hanging out, someone comes up and says, hey, you want to go with me too? Just stay clear of that.
You want to be a movie star, you want to be a model, you want to blah, blah, blah.
That's very seductive.
They know all the tricks.
It's very seductive. And then the last place is online, MySpace, Facebook. Make sure your kid has a private space that's not public, out to the world, and never, ever go and meet someone who says online, hey, let's meet. I'm your age. I'm a 16-year-old kid. Probably is not a 16-year-old kid who wants to be in a romantic relationship, but something else.
Yeah, it's just a recipe for disaster. Thanks so much. We could go on, but it's just great information.
Thank you very much. Yep. And I thank CBS for taking on this issue.